The last moments of Tiny Tim's life are full of anxiety, unwanted pressures, and pleas to stop and rest from his loved ones. Tiny Tim had a very sad and public ending to his life. Remarkably, it's very well documented for the time that Tiny Tim was alive in. We see a person that had a talent that hit it big for a moment at the right time, fading in and out with the public to where his career would end his life. This is the moment Tiny Tim died in front of the world. It's November of 1996, and the man known as Tiny Tim is still trying to make a living at his talent, even though his health is fading with a chronic heart problem, putting him in a terrible state. When looking at Tiny, even his face looks of death. Today's generation might not know of Tiny Tim, but he was a well-known figure decades before his death. The song that was Tiny Tim's bread and butter, that made his career, was Tiptoe Through the Tulips, a song that was written in 1929, but made famous in 1968 by Tiny Tim. The song is somewhat eerie now, knowing how it started and how it would end with Tiny Tim. In the late 80s and early 90s, Tiny Tim's career is going okay. He's still somewhat of a household name, and on TV more than people realize. He's giving interviews, laughing, having fun with people, seeming to enjoy where he's at, but all the while giving interviews, being a gentle, nice person that everybody says he was. Tiny Tim was no stranger to The Tonight Show, from the show pushing his career, being married on the show in front of millions of people, to where we see Tiny Tim in the early 90s continuing his friendship with the show, become friends with Jay Leno, and making monthly appearances on the show. And people always knew they would at least see Tiny Tim on The Tonight Show at Halloween time, where Tiny Tim would spend a lot of his time annually at Spooky World, enjoying Halloween and making his presence known. At the end of 1996, Tiny Tim is in between a rock and a hard place, where his health is out of control. His heart is not able to keep up with his high schedule demand. His mind is young and playful and looking for adventure, but his body is begging to slow down. Tiny Tim is trying to play shows as much as he can to stay active and pay his own bills, even taking shows at schools in front of children, having them sing along with him. But all the while, Tiny is doing his best to keep up and rebuild his career as much as he can, but just not playing the most lavish of show locations. Tiny, by 96, is on his third marriage, getting hitched in 1995 to a lady named Susan, and once again being a newlywed in love. To the public at times, Tiny was a bit of a weird act, still playing songs he was known for, and also covering popular songs in pop culture. Tiny had a few moments that maybe weren't the best for his public appearance, good or bad, admitting on the Howard Stern show that he wore adult diapers, and at one time showing his anger to Stern. The show was somewhat mocking Tiny for his belief in God, and Tiny wasn't having it. It's a different side of Tiny that has really never been seen before on tape. But sadly, the sweet, gentle person that Tiny Tim was, he was booking his own death on September 28, 1996, at the Ukulele Hall of Fame Expo in Massachusetts. What should have been his last show ever and almost sent him to the morgue. A wake-up call happened for Tiny Tim, but it would be very short-lived. Tiny Tim had an extremely long day. Early that afternoon, he had spent almost 3 hours recording songs, talking, for a video that would later be released. But what many people didn't know, including Tiny, this would be the start to the end of his life that no one saw coming. Tiny was exhausted, but he had a show to play that night for a crowd that's been waiting on him. We see Tiny enter the room, people applauding and cheering for him. No more than 200 people. Tiny takes the stage, looking and sounding in bad shape. With each word, he's gasping for air, and towards the end, Looking around, his eyes start to roll in the back of his head, and with no more than a few minutes on stage, Tiny collapses in front of everyone, falling off the stage onto the cold, hard, solid floor. Tiny is immediately taken to the local emergency room, where he spent almost 2 weeks recovering. Towards the end of it, he starts taking interviews, laughing, and saying how thankful he was to be alive, but that he can't wait to be back out again. Tiny has many conversations with doctors, where they tell him, not the news that he wants to hear, that he needs rest, needs to take the rest of the year off, and that he had a very close call. The day Tiny is released, it's quite the spectacle. Tiny is back on top when it comes to the media. Everyone's covering his story, but Tiny simply leaves the hospital and heads home, but not for long. Tiny is now home to rest and get ready for the holidays. With the end of November rolling around and Tiny Tim celebrating his last Thanksgiving, he would find himself back in the hospital, unbeknownst to the public, having severe chest pain. Doctors still asking him to take a break. Tiny told his wife in secrecy that he had stopped taking his medicine too, saying, "What difference does it make? One day, it won't matter." It was known that Tiny was already booked to play at a show at the end of November. The show was a benefit that Tiny was simply doing for free, out of the kindness of his heart. Hundreds of copies of Tiny's newest album would even be given to people that bought a plate that night that would sit down and enjoy the show. The benefit was for the Women's Club of Minneapolis. On November 30th, the day of that show, it was known to those around Tiny and his personal life that he was in bad shape, so much so that Tiny's own manager even called him the day of, begging him to cancel and stay at home. Tiny said, "I have to do this. If I was being paid, I could simply just refuse to not play and not be paid. I don't want them to think I'm doing it because I'm not getting paid, so I must do it." Tiny's wife recalled that day, saying that Tiny was short of breath and slow at moving. His legs were swollen and at times even confused. When they arrived to the venue, finding a place to park their vehicle and walking from there to inside the venue, Tiny was spent. The evening really doesn't get going till around 8 p.m. Tiny is set to play at 9. The house band that was hired to play runs over Tiny's time, well past 9 o'clock into 10 p.m. By this time, Tiny is exhausted. His wife looks at him and says, "I'm taking you home." Although at that moment, it's brought to the attention of the band that Tiny is supposed to be playing. The band abruptly stops. Some think the event is over and even leave. Tiny stands up, walks to the front, and starts to play. He performs 5 songs, and when playing the last one, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips," he stops halfway through the song and says to everyone, "God bless and thank you." He walks away. Susan, Tiny's wife, can see that something is wrong. She runs to him. Tiny grabs her arm. As she grabs him, Susan asks, "Are you okay?" Tiny said to her, "No, I'm not." It's obvious in this moment he recognizes the pain and feeling that is falling over him at that very moment. He falls into the arms of his new wife. From there to the floor, people scream and shout, yelling for help. Doctors from the crowd run to help, performing CPR. An ambulance arrives, loading up Tiny. They take him to the nearest hospital, where they work on him for almost an hour straight, trying to bring back his heart. But it's too late. The damage is done. With all the warnings, all of the begging, all of the pleas to rest weren't enough for Tiny Tim to stop. Susan was brought in to say goodbye to Tiny. She gave him a kiss on the forehead, saying, "I love you." At 64, Herbert Khaury was gone a little before 11:30 p.m. in 1996. In the end, it's a life that was lived long, full of excitement and bringing happiness to people. It seems that's all really Tiny Tim wanted, just to make people happy with his art. It almost seems that there was no saving him. He died doing what he wanted to do, and almost in a weird way, it seemed like he knew it was going to happen that night. Tiny Tim's story will always be around. It's unique, it's exciting, it's full of drama, and there's much more to say about it. Long live the memory of Tiny Tim.